he was named after a camp that they would send the grade 9s to like just like for group building
Mandy's
exercises.
eyebrows
For group building exercises.
We would
It was,
we would
I
send
went, it
the
was,
children to a camp.
No, we're
called
not going. This is
Negwigwi.
not the opening of the episode.
So I think I originally actually wrote this question down, and it comes for a very specific reason. As we move forward in technology, I noticed there's a very clear widening gap in my understanding of VFX. I've studied a great deal every format, but it's for some reason VFX is just something that like my brain has trouble wrapping itself around. I have done small tutorials on After Effects and all that sort of stuff, but it's just not something that I've sat down and actually hammered out, which means that like moving forward with my projects, I make sure that if I have a VFX shot that I need to that I need in it, I'm making sure that I know exactly what it is during production, like before production, so that when we get to that, I'm getting clean plates, or I'm getting exactly what the VFX team or whoever might be doing the VFX on it needs. Because I mean, I worked in post and I could see how like coming in with sloppy like assets just kind of costs a lot of time and headache. It's still something that I have difficulty wrapping my head around. I think I'm a very literal thinker, so sometimes it's like if in my mind what's not there, or if like the set's not there, it's like it's crazy for me to just kind of sit and go like, okay, but how does that need to work? So I think that's an aspect that I'm looking to get better on, and I know there's just a lot of facets of it, so it's kind of a daunting part to get into.
Yeah, I think for me, I could definitely say VFX because I don't know a lot about. I've done VFX on my own that have been very straightforward, like miniatures and very basic, like painting out of objects or something. But as far as like full-fledged like 3D visual effects or replacements of sets or things like that, I've never really touched in on those. But I think just to vary the answer. Honestly, in like the traditional sense of filmmaking, probably the aspect I know the least about, and mostly because I just self-taught, is editing. Like I never took like an editing class. I never really followed tutorials online. I just kind of, I started, I think, editing on Movie Maker when I was a child, and then moved into iMovie, then Final Cut, and then I've used Premiere and I've used Avid very sparingly, but now I'm in Resolve, and it's like, all of these things have kind of carried on forward, and I've just essentially been teaching myself the reins of these new programs without really ever having to A, like edit with another person, and B, learn about, organizing timelines and stuff. So it's definitely a place that I could absolutely improve on. In terms of the actual like theory of editing, though, I think I have it down pretty well, because editing to me is throughout a movie. Like when you're writing it, you should be thinking about what it's editing. And when I do a shot list, the shot list is essentially a list of edits. So that aspect I know about, but it's more like the actual technical steps of editing that I really have no idea what a professional editing setup is. Like if I were to sit down with a professional editor and they were to go step by step through their process of like organizing clips, what timelines they're using and things like that, it would be very new to me. It's just something that I also don't really have much desire to do. So I think that it's like a lack of interest in really diving deep into it. But yeah, that's me.
Well, I have a theater and performing background, so a lot of the things that kind of came naturally to me when I first started making films about a year or so ago were things like blocking and being able to use your actors to telegraph information to the audience based on their the relationship to the camera, and like if you could see, like you can see someone being duplicitous in the foreground, you see someone in the background that doesn't know something. That's something that I can make sense of. But what and even having done theater for a very long time, like I've always been really impressed by lighting crews and how they can sort of establish mood and make visual information more easy to distinguish for an audience based on where they put the light. But that's something that I've always struggled with. Like most of the shorts that I've shot, including one that sadly never came to fruition that I shot a couple of months ago, like I shot entirely in natural light because I wanted to give it that sort of like uncomfortable, almost like Cullen had a great description of like early YouTube kind of lo-fi aesthetic. But while shooting Hector, like it had occurred to me how little I actually understand about cinematography and the way of using the right lens to reverse a particular tone, or the amount of information you want to cram into a frame, or even how to make use of artificial lighting to sort of reinforce something that you're trying to make feel natural. I don't exactly have the words or the vocabulary to describe it, but it was really fun getting to watch Cullen work on Hector, to take some cues from him on that, because most of what we did on Wilfred, and I think on Renaissance Clown, was actually just purely natural, practical lighting.
It's interesting because when I went to like television school, you learn sort of every aspect of production, but you learn everything a little bit, so it's hard to become like really, really good at one thing. So editing is something that I've been doing like, you know, since I was a kid, similar to what Cullen said, where like I started on basic programs and then I was taught how to use Avid, you know how to use it. It feels like you can do so much more, but lighting I struggle with because I have a very specific image in my head, and trying to like reflect that back using lighting just like doesn't ever really make any sense to me. And I'm not great. There's a lot of technical parts of film that it's not that I don't fully understand. I don't understand them enough that I feel comfortable with them. And one of that is like lenses. One of that is like the combination of like camera work with lighting, particularly when a camera has to move. I sometimes have a hard time distinguishing what's gonna be the best part of that. And that's why I usually just rely pretty heavily on like a camera operator or a cinematographer to be like, this is what I want it to look like. And then you can sort of fill in the rest, but it's like I guess photography in general is something that is like, it's also very difficult and way more technical and like mathematic than I definitely thought it was when I was younger. And when you start making films on like a digital camera that you can't switch lenses out on, it's just sort of like one thing. It's something that you don't think about until you get older, and then it's like there's this array of things you can use, and there's all these different tools, and almost the more that you add into that, the more that I would be like, oh, this is like way more complicated. Like the job of like a focus puller, I think is like the coolest job, but also like so difficult, so technical, and so much more about math than anything else. And I just did not get into film for math.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, Cullen and Mandy, that, and even though Mandy, you were talking about lighting and photography and focus and stuff like that, which lines up with my thing, I both about editing when talking about learning about more about editing, because like Cullen, I'm self-taught. Like or I wasn't self-taught. I learned a lot about editing just from a co-op at Rogers Community Television. And I wanted to ask you guys, like, how much more can you learn about something that is so intuitive more often than not? Like, I actually just pulled up the Walter Murch principles here as reference, because he says that more often, like the number one thing that you're trying to communicate with an edit is like right here, he says cut for emotion. So I wanted to ask you, like, what else can you really learn about that kind of craft if all you're trying to do is achieve something that's simple?
For me, it's not necessarily that I don't know how to edit. It's more efficiency for me. Like, there are a ton of times that, you know, I'll be editing something and I'll have, like, you know, a compound clip within a compound clip because I want to combine two different effects or something like that. And I'm constantly thinking to myself, I'm sure that there is an easier, more efficient way to do this that doesn't take the time, the amount of time that I've spent on doing it. but it's just something that I've never really like gone in depth to learning just shortcuts in editing. So as far as the final product, I don't think you can usually really tell, like, you know, let's say Blair is an incredible editor who's been trained by the best in the world, and he cuts just a basic scene, and then I cut that same scene in a completely different way. Usually it's difficult to tell, you know, whose is whose if they're both competently cut. However, in the behind the scenes aspect, if you look at the timeline, I'm sure that Blair's being trained by these amazing editors, I don't even know if that's my image of Blair, would probably have a much more clean timeline, a much more concise timeline, and probably would have done it in like half the time that I did it. So it's kind of that aspect more for me.
I mean, there's also a lot of pieces to editing that, like, I like, in my opinion, I think kind of anyone can open up an editing software and like cut. I think cutting together a movie is complicated. It takes creativity. It takes, you know, knowing what you want it to look like. But actually pulling a clip onto a timeline and shortening it isn't really the complicated part. Like, especially in Avid, the point of Avid is that it's so customizable and you can do anything with it. But when you do that and you open it up, there's so many like buttons, and the first thing you have to do is organize your shortcuts. And I get like a lot of you get so much joy out of creating shortcuts so that you could really like speed through an edit. And the way that I was taught was, usually you're working with an editing team, so you have to sort of be able to pass a project along and have it make sense. So everything is like labeled, and you learn about like subclipping, which is literally like it's not even the editor, it's like the editing assistant will literally go through and cut takes up so you know what take is what shot, and they're all labeled, whether it's like, you know, kitchen fight take 1, kitchen fight take 2, and then putting them into bins. I love creating bins. But all of that stuff is really tedious and really boring. And it's not the fun part of editing where, you know, you get to see sort of a finished product, but it is kind of important. I think it's more important when you're working like professionally or in sort of a bigger like production. If you are the sole editor of something, you can kind of do whatever you want, because your eyes are going to be the ones that are on the actual sort of, like, as Cullen's saying, like organizing a timeline and having everything look a certain way.
Whenever I'm on Avid, I always feel like an old-timey train conductor. And like, you know, where you're like pulling like every knob and lever, and it's like, like that's kind of how Avid feels to me. But it's also one of those things that if you learn Avid, it's so intuitive once you've learned it. And like a friend of mine's dad has an Avid keyboard that has all his shortcuts on the keyboard and stuff like that. So